From being inspired by one of America's most horrific serial killers, spawning a legacy bigger than the killer's body count, here's the true story that inspired the Scream movies, starting with the inspiration behind the franchise. Now, not many people know this, but the Scream movies were actually inspired by real-life events. Yes, the movies are based on one of the most terrible serial killers, which is probably why it's got that pull with the audience. Now, Scream is always mentioned as one of the best scary movies ever made.
I regret coming here. Jesus, my mom was a character in one of them.
No one cares about the shitty, inferior sequels, Wes. You're safe.
It brought the once-dead slasher genre back to life for a new generation. Most people might think of the movie as one of the best of all time, but they don't usually think of it as one of the scariest. Like, sure, Ghostface is scary, but it doesn't have as much sadness as, say, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Scream tries to be enjoyable and even funny at times. The true story behind it isn't funny though, because Kevin Williamson was inspired to write his most famous work after seeing a show about one of America's most horrific serial killers. Daniel Rolling, also known as the Gainesville Ripper, may not be as well known as Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, or even Ted Bundy, but he was just as crazy. In August 1990, he killed 5 college students in Florida over the course of 4 days. 4 years later, a young scriptwriter saw a show on ABC called Turning Point about the crimes of the Gainesville Ripper. The show scared him so much that it made him write the screenplay for the movie Scream. Even though the Gainesville Ripper wasn't exactly young, and neither did he prank call his victims or wear a mask, he made Williamson afraid and gave him a feeling he wanted to write about. So how did it all start in the actual sequence of events? Well, in 1990, the Gainesville Ripper killed 4 people in 4 days. Daniel Rolling's spree began in 1990. He sneaked into a Florida apartment where 2 young college students were sleeping in the middle of the night. Sadly, they'd never wake up. He killed them both while they were sleeping and hid their bodies. One of them, Christina Powell, was sleeping on the couch in the living room and didn't hear the murders. He repeated this again with her the next day, but planned it in more detail. In the quiet of the night, Rolling snuck into her apartment and waited all night until she came home. He wanted the perfect murder, and he was ambitious enough to carry it out too. After the terrible weekend, people were in a state of shock. Many people thought of Ted Bundy, who killed several college students in Florida in 1978. It's sad to say that Rolling wasn't done. Apparently, this wasn't even the first time he'd carried out his evil plans. Daniel Rolling had killed before even coming to Florida. He stopped after this and didn't do anything for months. He could have stayed that way for the rest of his life or waited to strike again at some point, but his past would be his end. It turned out that the 5 college students from Florida were not the first people he killed. He had killed even more people the year before. Investigators saw a lot of parallels between the 2 killing sprees and thought that they were both done by the same person. Even though that helped, they still didn't know who that person was. They only had the killer's blood at the crime scene in Shreveport, which showed that he had type 8 blood. There were no more hints after that, but Rolling then made a fatal mistake that many killers have made. He gave too much away by constantly talking about himself to a Christian couple he befriended. At this point, the killings in Shreveport had already happened, but when it became public that the police thought both crimes were done by the same man, the fact that the crimes happened in Florida made the wife think of something else about Rolling that she couldn't forget, which is why it was obvious that he'd eventually get caught. Daniel Rolling was caught and found guilty of the crimes he committed. He might have committed horrific crimes, but he definitely wasn't the most clever killer. Investigators didn't have to do much to find Rolling, because he was already in jail in Ocala, Florida, where he'd been since he robbed a grocery store months earlier, about a week and a half after the last killings. Everyone now knew why people had stopped dying. It turned out that a bank was robbed on the same day that someone else was killed. With this link, detectives looked at the evidence from the robbery, like tape and tools, and found that they were the same as what had been used in the killings. Not Not only that, but they had also identified his blood type, not to mention that he had written about his crimes in a messy way in a book that they found. Talk about being obvious. Rowling was then caught and sent to court, although they discovered that he'd had a difficult childhood, which led to him being this way. That didn't really help his case. Rowling was found guilty of the crimes he had committed and given the death penalty. In 1994, when his trial was going on, ABC ran a show about it. That's how Kevin Williamson first found it. Even though he didn't write about the Gainesville Ripper in his script, it was about how scared he was that night. Williamson then gave us all that same fear. Since then, we've had to deal with it. Everyone loves horror movies, but it's one thing to see it on screen and another to know that it actually happened. There aren't many things that can compare to the thrill of watching a great horror movie. No matter how much of a horror fan you are, waiting for a serial killer to come out from behind the door can scare the living daylights out of anyone. Even scarier is the thought that some of the things that happen in movies, no matter how bad or immoral they are, have actually happened in real life. As ignorantly happy as it would be to say it's all made up, the evilest movie characters are based on real people and events. Scream isn't even the only horror movie to be based on a true story. There have been plenty of movies about serial killers that are based on real events. However, since this one's been pretty popular, almost everyone knows about it. Yup, I'm talking about the Zodiac. The Zodiac Killer deserves a movie more than anyone else because he's another real-life crime mystery that hasn't been solved and is also one of the most well-known. Based on Robert Graysmith's 1986 book, Zodiac is an epic story about a serial killer who left bodies all over the San Francisco Bay Area from the late 1960s to the early 1970s. It was directed by David Fincher and is based on Graysmith's novel. The exaggerated version not only shows how clever and scary the Zodiac Killer was, but it also stars big names from Hollywood like Robert Downey Jr., Mark Ruffalo, and Jake Gyllenhaal. Even so, these A-list players just seem like extras in this true crime story, especially when you look at how intense the story itself was. Of course, it wasn't the only one to twist a real-life story. This next one's equally terrifying. Helter Skelter. Helter Skelter is a 1976 psychological thriller TV show directed by Tom Grise and named after a famous song by the Beatles. The movie's based on the terrible things the Manson family did, which gives a whole new meaning to the word cult classic. The killings of the Manson family are some of the most difficult records to look at, and this movie's up to the task. In 1969, when the Tate LaBianca killings were found to have been planned by Manson, he first came to the attention of the public. Even though he didn't kill the people himself, he was able to get his followers to do it. This led to 7 deaths. Thankfully, Manson is now gone. He died on November 20th, 2017, after being in prison for 40 years.
Nah, I don't think so.
Don't hang up on me.
Having said that, that's all for the true story that inspired the Scream movies.